Welcome to School Choice Report, where we explore everything about one of the most important education topics. I'm your host, David Hardy. In this podcast, we'll be talking to experts, educators, and parents to get a deep dive into the world of school choice. Whether you're an advocate, skeptic, or just curious, this podcast is for you. So sit back, relax, and let's get started with the conversation. Hello and welcome to the School Choice Report. My name is David Hardy. Today we're welcoming back a good friend of mine, Professor Robert Strauss from Carnegie Mellon University. Professor Strauss joins us on the first episode of Season 2, and he is a distinguished economist with a remarkable research and academic background. Professor Strauss' career can be categorized by his relentless pursuit of excellence in the state-level tax policy projects and research effort. Welcome, Professor. I'm excited to have you back and dive into discussion.
It's great to be back, Dave. We had a lot of interesting conversations last time.
Yeah, and last time, for those of you who didn't hear this last segment, we talked about violence and safety in schools, and you had some pretty astounding research. What you brought here today, oh boy. My first question is, when did you become interested in studying teacher retention in Pennsylvania, and why does that interest you?
Okay. Well, that's a sort of a biographical question, and It goes way back to when I was a kid, okay, in the eastern suburbs of Cleveland, Ohio, which has a lot of snow, if you don't, by the way. Anyway, I was not big enough to play football. And I was not as good a pitcher as my father was in Toronto. He was Canadian. And so the baseball coach in my high school, which incidentally is where the Kelsey brothers went to.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Yeah. It's Cleveland Heights High School. So I had to find a sport to get my father's respect. And so I took up tennis. And I had a coach. And, coaches can make a difference, right, in one's life. And so my coach, who is a pipe-smoking math teacher and very patient with me, and he put up with the shenanigans of high school guys, too many hormones. And I said, I think I want to be like you. I want to be a teacher. He said, well, you want to be a college teacher. And one thing led to another, and got interested in labor economics when I was a graduate student at Wisconsin and studied tax policy, and that was the other. When I started out on the faculty at Chapel Hill, there were newspaper stories, and this was in the 70s, about test scores in North Carolina schools. And, North Carolina had a segregated school system up until the Civil Rights Act, and the 70s was not that far from it historically. And so I got very interested in looking at student assessments, and then I started asking myself, who gets hired to teach? Okay. And when I moved back to the Midwest, to Pittsburgh, to be closer to my family and the like, I decided that in the area of labor economics, which was one of my specialties besides tax policy, I would pay attention to student performance and teachers' preparation, selection, retention, because that seemed to me to be the core of what was going to make a difference for anybody to try to move forward in the public school system. I wouldn't say you're only as good as your teacher, but boy, if you don't have a good teacher who both motivates and respects you, it's like a problem.
You're exactly right.
And so that got me started on an odyssey, and I published this first paper about test scores in North Carolina, and I came up with this extraordinary result that a 1% improvement in teacher content knowledge was associated with like a 3 or 5% reduction in failure rate of kids at risk.
Wow.
It really made a difference.
Okay.
And so that was in the when I got out of graduate school, and then when I came to Pittsburgh and did work in the tax area, that connected me to state legislators and governors and the like, and secretaries of education. And I began to get access to very unusual data. So I did, in 1993 and 1998, 2 monographs for the State Board of Education of Pennsylvania. And what I learned from doing tax policy analysis is you really got to read the laws, okay? You can't just listen to what people say. And when I started to look at the empire, which is what I described to you last time as the school districts, the school boards, the State Department of Education, the teachers' unions, the officials, the various specialties. It's everybody is at this complex trough trying to get $15-20 billion a year spent somehow. And while I read the research literature, both from economics and from schools of education, what I was seeing was very different. And I was seeing things up front, close and personal. I came as a tenured faculty member to Carnegie Mellon, Dave, and that's really important because it gave me some independence.
Right.
And people trusted me to take on these very sensitive political issues. And what I discovered was that Pennsylvania, right after World War II, became a net exporter of teachers because we established the state system of higher education. And we went from about 60 teacher preparation colleges and universities, and now it's up to 102. It's unbelievable. Whoa. That every liberal arts college in the state system, which is the major producer, and Penn State, Temple, and so forth, everybody's got a teacher prep program. And when I was studying supply and demand of teachers in Pennsylvania, I looked very carefully at kids, at the demographics. Because that's what...
Can I cut you off? Didn't they call those schools teachers' colleges?
Well, they were actually called, way back, normal schools.
Okay.
And the way they used to work was that if you wanted to be a school teacher in the early 20th century, you would go to a Slippery Rock out here and do 2 years of post-high school education, get your teaching certificate, and that would then enable you to be a teacher anywhere in Pennsylvania. And there was reciprocity among the states. And over time, that 2-year program in the state system of normal schools got bumped up to 4 years, and the requirement became a college or at least a bachelor's degree. Yeah. So that was the early history.
Okay. Well, that's a good overview, but how does that impact education today?
Well, the way it works in both public schools and actually even in charter schools in Pennsylvania is that you have to be certificated. And so the state controls through the Department of Education that process. And there's these 100 institutions, and they have to every several years provide a plan to the state about what they're going to require for admission, what they're going to require for coursework in comparison to state standards for teacher prep. And then they, in effect, get audited when they ask to be renewed, to get their certificate program renewed. And this turns out in colleges and universities to be a business, okay? And especially with the state system, which got basically bumped from normal schools to 2-year colleges, this became a big producer of college graduates who wanted to become elementary school teachers, middle school teachers, administrators, high school teachers, okay? And so what you find is, as I looked at it and at the data, they gave me really any data that I wanted until Governor Rendell got very angry at me. And we can get into that as a segue if you want. We were producing in the 80s and the 90s anywhere from 8 to 15,000 new teachers a year. Okay, some with 1 or 2 certificates. But the demand, based on retirement and quits, was far less. And so what was happening is that young people were going to teacher prep programs all over the state and not finding jobs. And one of the projects I did for the state board, using projections of kids, the demographics, I said, look, the kids are getting older. They're going to have more secondary and fewer elementary, and you got to tell the schools of education to sort of recalibrate. But the state board, while they listened to me and they tried to improve some of the admission standards, really found it very hard to tell higher ed what to do. And the fact that we've got 100 instead of 60 teacher prep institutions with probably over 2,000 separate programs, elementary, math, chemistry, it's a huge number of things, including administrative certificates. The state is in no position to actually do a careful audit. So at one point in time, they had no more than 5 field people that were to go out to, at the time, 90 institutions to look at 2,000 programs. And there's no way you could actually do a reasonable job. And so what you find is that left to their own devices, any regulated institution is going to act in their own financial self-interest. Okay. And so attempts to raise the admission standards dramatically to improve the quality of the supply of teachers was never anything that the schools of education particularly wanted. And in the course of my research in Pennsylvania and my work with the state board, I got in touch with, or actually the Education Trust in Washington, which is a national interest group worried about public education. Katie Haycock was the executive director, and she actually got some federal legislation passed which required schools of education to report their placement results. In other words, what percentage of the kids getting certificated actually found jobs. And when I was looking at the data, it was really awful. A lot of places were only placing 35% of their kids, of their certificated students. Now, what we've had in Pennsylvania, if you think about the numbers, is hundreds of thousands of young people coming out of teacher prep programs who didn't get teaching jobs. And so while there's a lot of concern over the last couple of years, especially after the pandemic, with a lot of turmoil and quitting and the like that's going on, there hasn't been, by the state, an aggressive approach to telling school districts and even charter schools who's got certificates and where to look. And there is out in the West, paeducator.net, which is an online repository of about 40,000 people looking for teaching jobs in Pennsylvania, both in-state and out-of-state, with all of their credentials listed. And then the school districts and IUs and charter schools can go to this website and start a process of, are you interested? This is what we're looking for, and negotiate. I remember years ago when I was doing my 98 project for the state board, the superintendent of Erie School District, which is a pretty big place, was telling me he didn't know how to find physics teachers. And I was astounded because there were more physics teachers getting produced every year. If I looked at the certificate numbers, then there were vacancies that people were complaining about. I actually did a survey of all the school districts in the state saying what's easy, what's hard to find. And superintendents were very forthcoming. But there is this information asymmetry between each school district kind of looking and the young people coming out from all these places around the state and out of state. And Pennsylvania, unlike other states like Ohio, doesn't have a centralized data exchange so the market can work. Now, one of the advantages of that to the teachers union is they could keep wages up, right? They could say, look, there's a shortage. And, if I were a superintendent and wanted to find somebody in chemistry, biology, advanced, calculus, I would try to find retired engineers, retired scientists, people who want to do something, and try to work with the union and say, can't we do some kind of part-time deal here? Because otherwise we're not going to have anybody. And that would have a dramatic improvement and an impact on what we can offer in our educational institutions, our LEAs, and also because people came with work experience and want to go back and help kids to really make things better.
What do you think the likelihood that they would agree with that?
Well, I think. Well, let me tell you a little bit about how it works. When a district has money, and they say they need a science teacher, a biology teacher, a chemistry teacher. If the board has got their head screwed on right, they start trying to look around the region because they don't want to move people and see who's teaching advanced courses who could be moved. Okay, so there really is a market for excellence if the school board knows what it's doing and the superintendent wants to look. Okay, so what you've got is you've got a market where a district will go and poach. It's like any other labor market, okay? Now, they don't have to. They could say we don't want to offer an AP course or we don't want to require Algebra 2. There's a lot of things they can do to, in my view, shirk their responsibility to educate the kids who are in the district to the extent that the kids can be educated. Because the kids want to learn. I think people who say kids don't want to learn don't understand it. The kids need teachers who have the respect of the kids and the content knowledge. One of the things that I've been in favor of is when you're hiring a teacher, there's really two kinds of polar perspectives in the education research literature. One is that you want to find teachers who are strong in pedagogy, and the other is there are teachers who are strong in content knowledge. Now, they're not contradictory, but a lot of schools of education require an inordinate amount of classes on the history of teaching mathematics or how to teach mathematics. And the kids who graduate with a teaching certificate in mathematics have less coursework in college in math than a college major in math. And I think classroom kids understand when their teachers don't really know how to explain things, that they'll, in effect, sort of reading from the book and saying, I don't want to answer that or shut up. But if the teacher takes the time and says, well, you can look at it this way or you can look at it that way, and it's not just math, it's a whole bunch of subjects, well, that gets us to how do we measure what teachers know? And that's really a sort of a scary thing. So let me segue to that because the requirements to become a teacher in Pennsylvania are you have a bachelor's degree, and then you got to take two kinds of standardized tests that the College Board and the Educational Testing Service sell to all the states who want to buy it, okay? And what happens is there's the core praxis tests in math and reading and writing, and then there's the subject tests for middle school and high school. And it's not well known, but the studies that have been done independently on these core praxis tests show they're at about the fifth grade level.
Whoa.
Fifth.
Wow.
And if you take the passing score and translate it into percent correct, these are multiple choice questions on the test. Mm-hmm. It's like you've got to get 42% of your core math tests correct.
I saw that in your materials, and
that's a low number, Dave.
Okay, but see, that's what I wanted to find out because I didn't know what that 42. That's a percentage.
Yeah. So here's the.
Oh my God.
So if there were 100 questions,
mm-hmm.
you have to get 42% correct
mm-hmm.
in order to pass the certification test. And I just looked up this afternoon on the PDE website. 95% of the people who take these core battery tests pass. Okay? And it's not a surprise because it's fifth grade level and you only got to do 42% correct. Writing is 62% correct and reading is 56%. Okay? Now, when I got started with the state board in the 90s, they didn't have percent correct. They didn't even require somebody to teach high school physics to take a praxis physics test. Now they do. But the passing scores are very low. And the specialty tests are at 10th grade level, the last time anybody looked. If you're looking to hire somebody to teach, you got a lot of people who are passing these praxis tests. You've also got, if you can get the Department of Education to agree to something called waivers, you can hire college-educated majors who promise to get the pedagogy course is done in the summer.
Right.
And if you're a principal or a superintendent and you have your board with you who wants to be careful about who's in the classroom, you got a lot of freedom to choose. But that freedom works both ways, right? You can log roll and wind up hiring the daughter of a board member, or you can go out into the national market and say, who wants to teach English? And, what were your SAT scores? What are your praxis scores? And can we interview you? Can you give Can you give us a teaching example? Can you videotape?
Can I tell you that that I had a Latin school here in Philly,
right.
Okay, and I sent about 4 people to get certified in Latin, and they were all certified. And I looked around the school district, and I think there was only one other certified Latin teacher in the school district of Philadelphia. And the reason I know that she was certified is because she applied for a job with me and she didn't get it. She went someplace else. Okay? I'm wondering who makes that test up. I mean, how can they even get it done?
Well, listen, it's an industry, and it's not only cash flow to the testing companies, right? But it's also cash flow to the schools of education who admit the kids and then tell them this is where the jobs are. The number of elementary certificates issued each year, when I was doing my study in the 90s, there were 100 applicants for one elementary school position on average in the state, because that's a relatively easy certificate to get.
And this is in the 90s?
Yeah. Into the late 90s. And I'm sure it's still true today. Look, there are a lot of young, primarily women, who like little kids and might have been an older sister, to a younger sister or brother. And working 9 months, coming home at 3:34 gives you still time for a family life. And so they're led to believe that there's a job out there. Now, one of my reforms was to get each education school to publish publicly their placement rates so that the kids and the parents would know what they were getting into. But I don't think the Department of Education, they passed that, okay? The state board passed it, but I don't think they're publishing that data anymore.
They don't have, nobody makes them.
Yeah, right. It just sort of slipped away.
Yeah.
So, the advantage of requiring Latin in a school is because it is rigorous and it's the basis of languages, plural, right? And it teaches young people discipline, grammar, lots of things.
Lots of
right?
things, yes. It teaches them how to be a student.
Right. But you got to have teachers with that background.
That's right.
And you got to know where to look for them. And if you can't find them, it's like a problem,
Well, one of the things, there's a prominent, and I won't name names, there's a prominent university in Philadelphia who has a classics department who discourages the teachers, the students, classics students from going into teaching. Discourages them. What's that about?
Well, and I ask myself, and I'm sure you're saying the same thing, Dave, what do they expect a classics graduate to want to do? Become a classics professor? Well, there are not a lot of those positions. It's true, it's training and it's background, and that's good. But any serious civilization has to keep track of its history and understand the language that we came from. It's part of intellectual rigor. Here at my university, Carnegie Mellon, during the pandemic, we got rid of required SAT testing, like a lot of places. And there's a huge fight going on in my School of Computer Science with the university, and the university controls the admissions process, not the faculty, about whether we're going to go back to it or not. It's happening all over the country. And it's the same kind of thing that you're talking about. Who's standing up for academic excellence and hard work? I mean, I've always believed, I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I've always been one of the hardest working, that the human brain needs to be exercised. And in the course of that, we learn how to live a better life. And so It's just like the violence stuff we were talking about last time. If the buildings and the principal and the teachers are permissive about decorum and civility and bullying, then how can you expect kids to learn or to respect what's going on?
Yeah. How about that? You have to teach them to respect the process, and they
That's
don't
right.
do it. They don't do it.
Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say was that there's a guy here in Philadelphia, his name's Sharif El-Mekki, and he's former principal in the Mastery Charter School Network. And he retired from teaching and running schools. And he has this thing called the Center for Black Educator Development. And he's on a mission to increase the numbers of African-American teachers in the teacher ranks. The numbers of African-Americans who get certified in Pennsylvania are so
They're low.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I looked at that in the 90s when I was doing my stuff for the state board and met periodically with the superintendent in Philadelphia. And I told her, I said, look, it's like 5 or 6% statewide kids of color getting a teacher certification. And, you know, in Philadelphia and in Pittsburgh, where you've got very high percentages of kids of color, it's a nearly impossible task to fill the classroom with teachers and kids of the same ethnicity. And you've got to be careful because, you know, think about kids of color getting college educated throughout the Commonwealth. And think about young women because historically teaching has been primarily female occupation. A lot of barriers in the last 10 or 15 years in other occupations have been broken. And so young women and men of color are finding they can do better in other occupations.
They have the options. That is
true.
That's
right.
That's true.
So it's very difficult to try to produce enough kids of color who will want to and go into and stay in public education. And the kind of violence that we talked about last time in our urban schools makes it even tougher.
Sure. Listen, I don't know any teachers that are telling their kids to go be teachers. Okay. I don't see it.
Yeah.
I don't see it. And I mean, there are some, I know there are some, but not a whole lot.
Well, you know, I think that what parents have to try to understand for their kids is that making the classroom more respectful and respecting the teacher and respecting learning has got to be part of this process. And paying the teachers more, if you're careful, can make a difference, okay? But this selection process, given that the certification requirements are relatively vague and the standards not very high, especially if you look at what happens in Europe and in China in terms of who in college graduating classes goes on to K through 12 as a teacher, what their respect is and what they get paid, it's very, very different, okay? Because those societies have figured out that they have to value it more. And one of the corollaries to all this is it affects the standard of living of the kids. I mean, the states that are paying more attention to what's happening in the classroom are states that are going to attract business, and their jobs will be better paying. So there's a whole milieu of things. The problem is that you can't see it moment to moment. It takes years to get better, and it also takes years to get worse. And what I find from the empire is that they're not paying attention.
No. Let me ask you, some of our listeners might be wondering why we're talking about data, the data you're talking about, that's decades old. Now, and while some things may have changed since you published the research, the mechanisms of running our public schools, the bureaucracy, the teachers union, teachers colleges, the way we certify, they haven't changed. How do you see the previous research being relevant today, all these years later?
Well, I mean, it's frustrating for me personally because I've taken hard looks. I've assembled all the data. I've talked to people privately. I've worked with the unions. I've worked with the School Superintendents Association. You know, I try. And you can change things incrementally, but there are other forces in our society that are working in opposite directions. So it's a long haul. We talked about governance last time, and that's where I think I've come out, that you've got to get the indirect self-dealing out of the local governance of what's going on in each district. And you've also got to get it out of the state board and the legislature. I mean, this problem that we have in our society of people dealing indirectly for financial self-interest is not just public education. I think it's widespread.
Yes, I agree with that.
Okay. And the second thing is people have to get more involved. I mean, I don't think it's well understood that in Pennsylvania, if 10 citizens in a school district get upset about the conduct of a school board member who's elected, they can go into the county court of common plea, and petition the judge to have that school director removed.
Wow. There's some real breaking news here. Anybody, and this is specifically for Pennsylvania?
Yeah, it's current law.
Okay.
I bemoaned last time that I tried to get 3 school board members at the Pittsburgh Public Schools to meet with me privately so I could show them the spike in violence over the last couple of years, building by building. And I offered them a free lunch or dinner and accommodate them. And, they just basically blew me off. And so I was not happy about that. And I promised them in an email what I'm just telling you. If there's 10 parents in the Pittsburgh Public Schools who don't like what's going on with a particular school board member who's perhaps, say, indifferent to student misconduct and doesn't want to enable people in authority in the building to restrain kids so they don't beat each other up, they could go into the Court of Common Plea in Allegheny County and they could file a suit. And I don't know what a judge would do, but, it's certainly going to get noticed.
I think it would. I think that's certainly something to know and to have in your quiver.
Democracy is in a state of ferment throughout the country, okay? It's all over the place. And school boards are being petitioned by parents about curriculum, about gender, about all kinds of stuff, okay? And I think ultimately it's healthy that parents take an interest in what's going on in the classroom. And what the empire has to realize is the parents are paying the taxes, by and large, one way or another. And everybody pays a sales tax, Dave. Don't tell me that in poor districts people aren't paying taxes.
They're paying taxes.
And they're paying rent, which pays property taxes,
Sure. But in when I went to school, my mother didn't care about what they taught me because she trusted the school. And I think there was a lot of that for a long time. And I think the pandemic, with parents being able to see what was going on, I think it eroded that trust. And I'm wondering how you ever get that back.
It's not going to be easy. I don't think our elected officials in Harrisburg actually understand the phase shift in trust in public education that you're describing, okay? I think the pressure is going to build. The charter movement and choice is going to become increasingly prevalent because people don't want to say, I'm going to wait for 12 years or until there's reform.
Right.
They want to be able to take care of their kids' learning needs because every parent knows from any background whatsoever, if your kid doesn't get educated, it's not going to be to their benefit later on or to yours. They've got to be literate, numerate, and articulate, and they got to be able to think, not just memorize, okay? And they got to be able to solve problems. And that's work. And parents who think that the teachers in a lot of school settings are making the kids work would be in for a surprise. And I think you're absolutely right about the pandemic. I think they saw what was going on with the remote stuff. And people said, what is this? Now, there are happy stories and there are sad stories. But if you look at public school enrollment in Pennsylvania compared to the number of kids, it's been going down a couple of percentage points each year as people are moving to charter and cyber charter. It's a fact.
Philadelphia, the school district has been bragging that their enrollment increased this year. But what they don't tell you is they closed 3 charter schools that were formerly Philadelphia public schools, those Renaissance schools. They took them back, and that's what saved them. And I didn't say by how much, but I'll bet you it's less than 100 kids. I mean, it's a small amount. They've been going down. They were before the pandemic. They had lost a lot of people, and I don't think the numbers that they're saying post-pandemic make sense when you look at all the other losses through the pandemic and you look at their losses over the years. It didn't seem like it was big enough, but we'll see.
In Pittsburgh, Dave, the numbers are really startling. Pittsburgh public schools, when the city's economy, steel, heavy industry was booming, they had like 70,000 kids.
Wow.
Well, now they're down around 19, and they absorbed Wilkinsburg, by the way.
Here's the point. I was on when Mike Fisher was the Attorney General. I was on his Safe Schools Task Force. And that's when I first had interaction with educators from Pittsburgh. And at that point, Pittsburgh had about 28,000 students.
That's right. You plot it against time, and it just keeps going down. And we don't have charter because the school board in Pittsburgh really will not allow charter. I mean, what happened in Philly is Dwight Evans got energized when, he was in the state legislature. And so you've got a lot of kids in charter schools now because so many parents in Philadelphia were just very angry. I'll never forget. I went to Philadelphia at Dwight's request. I met him when I did a tax policy thing in Harrisburg on the property tax. And we drove around to parts of his district. Mothers were coming up to me, screaming at me because they thought I might be able to influence things. And they wanted the freedom to get their kids into a learning environment so that the kids could progress. I mean, it really was, for me, a very personal event. And, I thank Dwight for that because he cared, he did it. It was not easy to do in Philadelphia because the teachers union fought him tooth and nail.
Didn't make him popular. Well, listen, Professor, it's always a pleasure having you on this show. And I'm sure I'm going to want you back again.
Thanks for the opportunity. It's good talking with you because we're on the same page.
I think so. I think we are. And I want to say this, that please don't stop doing what you're doing. This is the stuff that people don't know that they should know, that policymakers need to know this. Legislative people need to know this. And my fear is if somebody like you doesn't do it, it won't be around.
Well, I'm not always the most popular guy in Western Pennsylvania or even on my university campus because I've decided finally to say a few things publicly that I've known for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Well, listen, thank you again. This has been Professor Robert Strauss with David Hardy on the School Choice Report. Thank you for listening. That's it for today's episode of School Choice Report. I hope you found the conversation enlightening and informative. If you have any feedback, questions, or suggestions for future episodes, please reach out to us at schoolchoicereport.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our show wherever you listen to podcasts so you'll never miss an episode. Until next time, this is David Hardy signing off. Thanks for tuning in.